My name is Dan Finn, and I'm happy that you're here for this lecture this evening. I want to say a few things about our process and then introduce our speaker. Our lecture will go for about 40 minutes, followed by questions and answer, probably ending about 9:30, depending on the energy in the room. I would make a comment for those first-year students in the room for whom this might be your first large lecture on campus. It's a really good thing to be here for the lecture, but it's even better to be here for the questions and answers, because you get a chance to hear our speaker talk on his feet and answer questions. And so please, I hope you will stick around for the question and answers. I know all of the upperclassmen will. After the lecture is over and the question and answer period is over, there'll be a reception out in the lobby with some cookies and juices. Our speaker tonight is a professor of economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has his BA in psychology from Tufts University and PhD, along with MA, from Harvard. He is taught at Harvard, at the University of Chicago, and at the European University Institute in Florence. He is the director of the Disability Research Center at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is a research affiliate at the Poverty Action Lab, a very creative institution in Cambridge, and co-director of MIT's initiative on school effectiveness and inequality. He has a long list of awards and honors. I'll mention only a few. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Econometric Society, fellow of the Labor Economist Society, and was recently voted Best Professor, an award at MIT. He's been an editor or associate editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, the American Economic Journal, the Journal of Labor Economics, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. He has many publications. I'll just mention some of the topics that he's dealt with. Worker adjustment to international trade, the China shock, learning about worker adjustment in that trade, the VA's disability compensation program, the minimum wage and wage inequality, private disability insurance, rent controls, women's wages following World War II, and the question of computers, have they changed the labor market and in what way? The gender gap in educational attainment. And one that's perfectly relevant here in our political season, are we importing political polarization, the electoral consequences of international trade? So he's done work in many different fields and has been highly respected by his fellow economists. I hope that you will join me in welcoming with me Dr. David Autor, who will speak on rising inequality among the other 99%.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And it is an honor to be here at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict giving the Clemens Lecture. And thank you for welcoming me to your community. Actually, I've had a wonderful afternoon and evening just getting to know people here. And this, I'm just so touched by the community and the close-knitness of the faculty and students. So it's really an honor to be welcome to your community. I'm going to talk tonight about inequality, and focusing on the part of inequality that most people don't talk about, which is the other 99% of it. I'm going to try to make the case that it's something you should think about. And I'm going to talk about not only, inequality in the abstract. I'm not going to start from the assumption that inequality is actually intrinsically a bad thing, but I want to talk about what is inequality for, and can we have too little of it, and can we have too much of it? And if so, how would we know that we had too much or too little? So let me start off with the following figure. Probably almost all of you have seen some version of this figure. Originates with a work by Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty, looking at the growth in the share of national income or labor income going to the top percent of households. And you can see, if you look at the blue line, that the share of all income going to the top 1% rose from about 9% in around 1978 to almost 18% as of 2015. So that's a very dramatic increase in income inequality. That means a lot more resources going to a very small percentage of households. So it's useful to ask, how big is that in fact? How much of a change is that? So one way to scale that is to say, well, imagine we took all of the gains of the top 1% of households and we rolled them back to 1979. So their share in income stayed the same. And then we redistributed that money to the other 99% of households. How much would that be per household? Well, the answer is about $7,000 per household. That's a lot of money, right? No question, that's a big deal. Now I want to show you another set of numbers to potentially compare that to. This figure shows you the median gap in annual earnings of full-time workers for those who have a four-year college degree versus those who have just a high school degree. So if we look at men, for example, that gap was $17,000 in 1979. As of 2012, it was about $35,000. For women, there's an expansion of that gap of about $10,000. So if you imagine a two-person college-headed household and a two-person high school-headed household, so both of the same education, the gap between them has grown by $28,000 in the same period. So $28,000, that's 4 times that notional transfer, that notional redistribution from the 1% to the other 99%. In other words, what this says is a much bigger factor in rising inequality from the perspective of most households is the changing return to education. And it's important here, I'm presenting the medians specifically because these are not influenced by the top percentiles, right? These are the midpoint of the distribution, not an average of the distribution. So whatever the 1% does, it doesn't actually affect these medians. So there's basically been an increase in this gap of $28,000, 4 times the kind of redistribution from the 99% to the top 1%. I also want to point out that rising inequality is not just a US thing. People obviously we focus a lot on that, but if you look across the developed world, this shows you the ratio of income at the 90th percentile of the distribution to the 10th percentile, and the change in that ratio between 1980 and 2012. And in almost every wealthy economy except for France, and we know France is always an outlier. If it didn't look different, we'd know it wasn't France, right? That has increased, by multiples on the order of 1, 1.5, 2. The U.S., of course, is at the far end. Inequality has risen more here, but nevertheless, there is a continuum. And that rise in inequality is not simply a matter of changing norms, changing ethics, although it has some component of that. A lot of that is rewards to skills. So this figure shows you, just in the cross section, the wage return or the wage differential for a standard deviation higher basic cognitive skills. The way this is measured, there's the OECD puts together a survey called, a test called the PIAAC, and it's translated into multiple languages, made consistent, and then given to adults across the world. And then you can use that in combination with wage data to say, well, how much does someone with a higher PIAAC score earn? So if we look at a 1 standard deviation unit, which covers typically about 15% of the distribution, the return to that 1 standard deviation PIAAC score, or basic skills, ranges from about 12% in Sweden to about 28% in the United States. And those little red whiskers on the end of each bar tell you the confidence band of that. So, within 95% confidence interval, how wide do we think that is? And the first thing to notice is that this is very substantial in every market economy. Every market economy rewards skills, rewards cognitive ability, rewards communication skills, rewards analytical skills, rewards the ability to read, interpret, and communicate information. The US is high by that standard, but not off the charts. So there's a continuum. We are at the extreme of that continuum, but we are in no sense anomalous. So the next question you might ask is, well, why are the returns to skill so high in the United States. And an interesting fact, and not the one most people would guess, behind that is that we have actually had slow growth of education in the United States. So from cohorts born in the early 1930s up through cohorts born in the early 1960s, we had a phenomenally rapid rate of growth in educational attainment in the United States. It was about it was on the order of about 1.5 years on average per decade. And these line, the blue line and the red line, show you the fraction of young adults by year of birth who have a high school degree relative to not a high school degree. And if you look at the red and the blue, they're moving in parallel. Men and women are increasing rapidly. And then around 1973, all of a sudden that growth of male college attainment falls off very steeply. What happened? Can anyone guess what was the proximate cause? Why did men stop going to college after 1973? The Vietnam War ended, and the men were much less likely to be liable to be drafted if they remained in higher education during that period. So men stopped going to college at that point, or not stopped going, they stopped increasing their rate of college attainment. And in fact, there was almost no pickup again until the year 2005. Notably, women did not do so. Women's educational attainment, which had been rising in that period, took a little bit of a dip or decelerated a bit, but then it picked right back up and moved steadily. So, for example, in 1980, if you look among US men and women ages 25 to 34, men were 7 percentage points more likely to have a bachelor's degree. Look, in 2010, 30 years later, among young men and women ages 25 to 34, women were 8 percentage points more likely to have a bachelor's degree than men. So that's a 15-point swing in a 30-year period. Now, part of that is good news. Women are going for higher education. That's natural. That's what should be occurring. The distressing part is that young men have not done so. So why does this matter? Why do we need to keep raising educational attainment? Is it enough to just have educated people? Well, the answer is that as decade over decade our economy has changed, the importance of literacy, numeracy, analytical skills, writing, and communication creativity have risen, have become more important. Physical activity, manual dexterity, strong back, less important job skill nowadays relative to things that you learn in school. And so over the course of a century, the demand for educated workers has risen pretty steadily as far as we estimate it. But what has not risen as steadily is the supply. They've actually fluctuated. So this figure shows you, panel A of this figure, shows you the aggregate supply of college labor to the US economy. So on the prior figure, just want to make clear, in this prior figure, these are just young adults. And so you see these very sharp changes. This shows you the average over all adults. And you see that deceleration 82 as the young adults are not hitting the market with a college education. And then you see pickup again after 2005. If you do a very simple estimation where you say, imagine demand is moving out steadily at a year-over-year rate, and when supply of educated labor moves at the same rate, inequality stays about the same. In other words, the college premium doesn't rise. When the supply of educated labor moves out faster than the demand, then the premium actually falls. And we saw that, by the way, occur. Those cohorts in the 1970s, the premium to college was falling because people were getting so much education so rapidly. We thought that was love of learning. It turned out to have more to do with the draft. So a good chunk of this rising return to college education actually is driven not by a sudden pickup in demand for college labor, not by a big technological discontinuity that made educated workers so valuable. It's that demand had been moving steadily for a good long time, and then people stopped going to college, or at least stopped increasing their college attainment year over year. And that led to, that's the largest single contributor to the growth of inequality among the other 99%. So let's look at that carefully. Is that good news? Is that bad news? It's mixed news, actually. There's some good news here. The first piece of good news is that the payoff to college education is higher now than it was 50 years ago, substantially so. So you've all heard about the rising cost of college education, the student loan bubble, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, net of tuition, the present discounted lifetime value of a college degree has risen by about $350,000 for men and by about $250,000 for women. So in this period, there's been a dramatic rise in the investment value of a college degree. I think that comes as a surprise to many people. Many people, you hear these newspaper stories about, the NYU ethnomusicologist with $200,000 in debt who's sort of pulling lattes at Starbucks and so on. This is quite anomalous. On average, if we look across college-educated adults, they have higher earnings, higher employment rates, lower rates of unemployment, they have steadier jobs, they do well. Even people who enter college degrees in a weak labor market and initially start at Starbucks, you look out 10 years later, they're typically in jobs that are appropriate for their educational levels. So this is good news at one level. It's good news that there is something that people can do to affect their lifetime earnings that's practical and accessible, which is go to college, learn a useful skill, and then they have a chance at a good career and economic stability. Those are not the only goods in life, but that's a good starting point. And so then we should ask ourselves, well, is there any downside to that? Is that all problematic? If it's all about rising returns to education, is that just good news? Well, let's start from the point of view of what is inequality for? What does it do in a market economy? Well, the first thing that inequality does is it provides incentives. If we didn't actually have, if people with a PhD who spent 20 years in school, or 22 or 25 or whatever, had the same annual earnings as people who spent 10 or 12 years in school, probably many people wouldn't go on in law, they wouldn't go on in medicine, they wouldn't go on in engineering. So inequality provides incentives for people to get education, and moreover incentives for them to create new ideas and new products, to found companies. It creates a certain level of economic dynamism. Right? Because if we had a society that was extremely equal regardless of what actions you took, then we would see people doing a lot, working less hard, doing less difficult things, not learning skill sets that are extremely valuable to us, and maybe not innovating to the same degree. So you certainly could have a country that could have too little inequality. In a market economy, you need some inequality. It provides incentives. It provides a signal of what is valued. So then, can we have too much inequality is the next question we should ask. And I think there's a case that we can, and perhaps that we do. So let me make that case to you. This figure shows you the real earnings of men and women from 1963 to 2012, and they're indexed to their starting point in 1963. So they're indexed to 1. So you can see, for example, if you look at the upper blue line, that's men with greater than a bachelor's degree, right? Their real earnings have gone from 1 to 1.8, so an 80% increase in this time period, and very steadily so. If we look at men with a bachelor's degree, they've increased by about 40%. If you look at the bottom 3 lines, you'll see that many of them have fallen substantially since 1980. So in particular, for high school educated or high school dropout males, real earnings have fallen by as much as 20% in the last 30 years. For women, the story is much more positive in the sense that these are all upward sloped, but of course, they diverge substantially. So the good news is highly educated people doing well, the return to education rising. The bad news is part of that rising return to education is the falling bottom, right? Part of the reason is that it's never been a better time to be a college grad is it's never been a worse time to be a non-college worker in America, right? The reason it's so good to go to college is because it's so terrible not to go to college. So Why is that problematic? Why is it problematic that earnings in particular, are falling for less educated workers? Well, one of the problems of substantially falling wages is that people may actually choose not to work. They may actually start to drop out of labor force. And we see that pretty clearly in the US data. So in particular, this figure shows you on the x-axis is the percentage change in male hourly wages among men who are working ages 25 to 39 between the years 1979 through 2008. So this is not the same individuals. This is a cross-section of people who are 25 and 39 in 1979, a cross-section of those who are 25 to 39 in 2008. These points, let me explain the rubric here. The three colors refer to white, other non-white, and black adults. And the letters GTC means greater than college, CLG is college grad, SMC is some college, HSG is high school grad, and HSD is high school dropout. So if you look from right to left, you see declining education, right? So on the left-hand side, almost everybody's a high school dropout or a high school grad. On the right-hand side, everyone has college or greater education. And so the x-axis tells you that earnings have fallen substantially for less educated adults. The y-axis is the fraction of them working in the labor force or actually employed. And what you can see very clearly in this figure is males that are facing falling potential earnings in the labor market are choosing not to work. And I want to say choosing not to work because women with the same skill levels are not making the same choices, right? Employment to population rates have not fallen for women despite their at the same levels of education, often typically at lower wages. They are choosing to work. Low educated men are choosing not to work. So that has potential consequences, and I'm going to talk about what those are. But the first point I want to make is falling wages, rising inequality may not be a bad thing per se, especially if his wages are rising at the top and sort of, holding constant elsewhere. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that part of the rise in inequality comes from a falling bottom, and that seems to be wages are sufficiently low near the bottom that many men are choosing not to work. You might say, well, what are they doing instead? Well, one thing they're doing is engaging in criminal activity. They may be receiving disability benefits, or they may be leading pretty marginal existences. That's quite possible. So why? What's the problem? Well, first, let me talk about what's went wrong, and then let me talk about what are the consequences of that. There are really three different things that I think are central to understanding the story. So the first one, as I already mentioned, is the stagnation of male educational attainment. Women's rising education has meant that as the labor market return to college has increased, women have been able to take advantage of the set of opportunities that are available, right? Increasing employment in professional, technical, and managerial employment. Women are the majority of students in law school now. They are the majority of students in medical school. Those, by and large, are high-paying career jobs that are actually also pretty interesting to do. So because men have not kept pace with education, they are increasingly competing for those lower-paying jobs and increasingly choosing not to do that. So not to do that work. So one of the causes is fundamentally the shift in educational attainment that we saw for cohorts that were in college after 1973. A second factor that is quite important in understanding this is the changing nature of occupations in the United States and in many rich countries. Growth of employment in the United States looks a lot like a barbell with sort of increasing poundage on either end of the bar. On the one side of the barbell, we see growing employment in high-wage, high education occupations like doctors and nurses, engineers and software developers, or managers of sales and marketing. Simultaneously, we see rapid growth in many low education in-person services like food service, cleaning, security, home health aides. And then what we see declining as a share of employment are many middle education, middle skill jobs like production and operative positions and clerical and administrative support positions, which typically offered a middle class living to people who didn't have a college education. This phenomenon, which economists typically call labor market polarization, is problematic because it knocks out rungs in the ladder of economic opportunity, it threatens to shrink the size of the middle class, and it potentially makes our society more stratified. On the one hand, a stratum of highly educated, highly paid adults doing interesting work. On the other, a growing stratum of adults whose primary job it is to see to the health and comfort of the affluent. That's problematic, and so that shrinking middle poses an economic threat to the kind of health of the middle class. What's going on there is not mysterious. I think we understand fairly well why are these middle set of jobs contracting. An important force is automation. Many of those middle skill tasks follow well-codified, well-understood rules and procedures that are increasingly feasible to codify in software and automate, whether we're talking about assembly line work or office work or sales work or even a lot of low-level managerial work that's really just information tracking. We're good at automating that. We're not very good at automating those very high-end jobs that require expertise, judgment, creativity. We're also not very good at automating a lot of those low education jobs that require manual dexterity, sightedness, visual recognition, a little bit of spoken language. So it's much easier to program a computer to play an unbeatable game of chess than to vacuum a room. It's much easier to have a machine, expertly install windshields on a car than to have a machine that could change a bedpan or help an individual to go for a walk in the morning. So this phenomenon is a technological phenomenon, but it does create a challenge for the structure of opportunity. And I'll just say, I won't linger on this point further, I'll just say that we see this not only in the United States, but in much of the rich world, this phenomenon of the polarization of employment. The third factor, which I won't linger on, but I do want to point out, is in the last 15 years, globalization has had significant consequences for the U.S. labor market. This is something, for decades economists have said, not something to worry about. Most of the changes in the labor market have to do with technology. The world is, a big place, but it's not a big factor here. It actually turned out, to the surprise of most economists, I think, that China's accession, joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, was a pretty significant competitive shock to U.S. employment, particularly to U.S. manufacturing employment. And we can say with some confidence at this point that there was a decline of over 1 million manufacturing jobs, probably considerably more than that, between 2000 and 2007 due to China's changed competitive position after joining the WTO. Now, to put that in perspective, 1 million jobs is actually a small number in a labor market of 150 million people. So you might say, well, it's kind of rounding error. Who cares about 1 million jobs? But it is unfortunately the case, or inevitably the case, that with manufacturing jobs, manufacturing is very geographically concentrated. Most of the furniture in the United States is made in the Carolinas or made in Tennessee. Most of the textiles and apparel come from just a few locations. Most of the assembly of toys and dolls happen in just a few places. So when there's a big competitive shock to manufacturing, that's felt in a very focused way in a set of communities where you see individuals losing work, plants closing down, and then all the supporting activities, all the stores and the restaurants and the services that go with that, also closing down simultaneously. So this has had a very concentrated impact in a subset of locations. This little map shows you some of those locations, many of them along in the South and along the South Atlantic. So this has been a big deal, and actually in research that I've done with my co-authors David Dorn and Gordon Hanson and Kaveh Majlesi, we also show that this has actually fed into political polarization in the United States, that these areas that have been particularly trade impacted kind of radicalized, either electing officials who were very far to the right or very far to the left in the decade of the 2000s, particularly to the right, as you won't be surprised to learn. So why does this matter? Why, other than you may be feeling at this point, you may be feeling sleepy. You may be feeling, I feel bad for these guys, but that life's tough. They'll make do, or if they don't, that's their own problem. I want to make an argument about why that's more than just their own problem. So let me show you another figure that looks like the one. You might say, why is Otter showing us the same figure again? But actually, this is very slightly different from the figure I showed you earlier. On the x-axis, again, is the change in male hourly earnings of men ages 25-39 by race and education group between 1979 and 2008. On the y-axis is the fraction of women of the same education, age, and race group who are married. Women are choosing not to marry men who have falling earnings. That's a very robust and striking fact. Why is that happening? Makes a lot of sense. It goes back to canonical economic theory of marriage. Marriage is in some cases a romantic, there may even be love involved, I've read, but it's also an economic activity. When a household you can think of as an economic unit that takes an income, produces children, and produces a lot of other goods and goods and bads and indifference. But the main point I want to make is, from the perspective of a person choosing to marry, one of the crucial attributes you should consider is this person a viable economic partner? Will they provide a stable income, or will they just be another mouth to feed? Will they make good decisions, or will they be someone who effectively becomes another dependent? And the data strongly suggests, and actually also the anthropological evidence suggests that women increasingly see low education men as non-viable partners for a household. And in fact, there's a cost to marrying them. It's not simply that they might not provide great income, but when you marry someone, you are also giving them property rights, control rights, and particularly control rights over children that you have. And that actually may be less good than sort of keeping them out of the picture. And so although marriage rates have fallen very substantially among low-educated adults in the United States, fertility has not fallen very much. And in fact, at this point, 45% of all U.S. children are born to non-marital households. And if we looked at non-college households, the majority of children are born to non-marital households. Now, I'm not casting a moral judgment about that. That's a choice that people make that may or may not be ethically problematic. However, it is economically problematic because children in non-marital households there are going to be three resources that they're going to have less of. One is they're going to have less sustained high-quality parental attention because typically if it's a single-parent household, that parent has a lot of work to do. Second, they're going to have access to fewer resources. There will be less income. The poverty rate of children in single-parent households in the United States is over 30% versus about 13% for the population at large. The third thing they're going to have less of is high-quality schools and safe neighborhoods. So children being born into single-parent households face disadvantage. They face the disadvantage of lesser investment. And that's the problem with the way the labor market is interacting with the marriage market, is that it's perhaps particularly disadvantageous to the children of those individuals. And we can see some of this inequality of household circumstances bleeding into inequality of childhood outcomes. So this figure shows you the per capita child enrichment expenditures for the top versus bottom quartile of households for cohorts born between 1972 and 2005. So you can see if you look at the lower line, the bottom quartile of households has increased their expenditure on children significantly, from $835 on average to $1,315. So that's more than a 50% increase. That's quite large. Look at the upper quartile. They've more than doubled it from under $4,000 to about $9,000. That's a pretty big difference. Does that matter? Well, one way you can see that that may matter is if you look at gaps in years of completed schooling. This is again between the top and bottom quartile of households, and this is for children born between 1968 and 1996. And you can see in 1968, for the top versus bottom quartile, that gap was about 2 years. By 1996, that gap is 3 years, 3 years is a lot, or an additional year is a lot. It means 1/4 more kids going to college and getting a 4-year degree, for example. And so this is pretty concerning in a period in which college has become more central to people's economic lives, where higher education is more critical to actually reaching the middle class and having an economically stable and comfortable lifestyle. The relationship between household and income and college going has gotten steeper. So you might have thought as college becomes more important, everyone would do it. There would be less of an economic gradient. In fact, just the reverse has occurred. College attainment rates now are near 100% among kids from the top quartile of households. They're under 30% in the bottom quartiles of households, and that's steeper than it used to be. One way you can see that is in college attainment, even among those who start. So this figure shows you the fraction of kids who enroll of those who enroll in college, what fraction have a BA, a bachelor's degree, within 6 years of enrollment. For the very top 7% of households, that's 80%. For the top quartile, that's 76%. And then if you follow that down, for the bottom quartile of households, of the kids who start college, less than half have completed a 4-year college degree within 6 years. That's a pretty substantial failure rate. And when I say failure, I don't mean they're failing grades, but failure to succeed, failure to launch. The US leads the world in sending kids to college. We have the highest fraction of our high school graduates who go on to enroll in a college institution. The fraction of our high school graduates who actually complete a college degree is 13th in the world. We're good at getting people started. We're not at all good at getting them out the other end. And that's problematic, not just because they've spent their time on that, but because typically they've acquired a lot of debt along the way. It's very risky to start college, acquire a lot of debt, and not finish it. You're going to be facing a lot of the downside without any of the upside. And if you're from a less affluent family, even more so, because no one's going to be able to help you pay those loans. And college loans, unlike your auto loan or your mortgage, that's not something you can forswear. That will follow you pretty much to the grave. Sorry. Okay, so let me pull these points together. So here's the risk about inequality. I start off by saying we need inequality to create dynamism, to give incentives, to stimulate people to make investments. The danger is that sufficiently high levels of inequality can potentially lead us from dynamism to dynasticism. In other words, where inequality of circumstance in the current generation creates such inequality of starting points in the next generation that it's very difficult for kids to compensate for the lack of success of their parents. Right? So America, I would argue, is a great meritocracy from sort of the 50th percentile on up. But when we look below that, many of the children in families in the US are sufficiently starved for resources, for good schools, for safe neighborhoods, that they really don't have a chance to realize their potential. If you think about those households that are spending $8,000 a year on their kids' enrichment expenditures, and I confess to spending much more than that on my children's enrichment expenditures, those kids, my kids certainly, are being overinvested in relative to their economic potential. It would be, from a welfare perspective, be much better to take that money and give it to kids who have less because their potential is not being sufficiently nurtured. Not only is that kind of unfair and unappealing ethically, it's also inefficient. It means that there's all this talent in the world that we're not harvesting, that we're not investing, that we're not cultivating. And meanwhile, if a mediocre kid is born to a successful family, well, that kid could, run for president. This figure makes this point as a cross-national relationship. This figure shows you on the x-axis income inequality. So this is a measure of the inequality of incomes at a point in time. So as you move rightward, you move to countries that have more inequality at a point in time. So at the bottom is Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, all the northern European welfare states. At the top is the US, the UK, and Italy. If you went further out and extended this to include non-wealthy countries, the next stop would be Brazil, and before long you would be in China in terms of levels of inequality. The y-axis is the correlation between fathers' incomes and their sons' income at about age 35. We do this typically for males because of high labor force participation rates. And you can see that in countries that have high levels of inequality, fathers' incomes are much more predictive of their sons' income. In other words, the intergenerational linkage of incomes is much stronger in more unequal countries. And so this figure presents, at least as a set of correlations, it's hard to prove that this is causal, but it's strongly suggestive that we run the risk when we have very high levels of inequality that we actually create a less mobile society. And I think that's really inimical to most people's vision of what a healthy, democratic, meritocratic country is. We want a country where you are rewarded for your hard work, you're rewarded for your capabilities, and you earn your place in the world. And we don't want one where your circumstances of birth, and particularly the affluence of your parents, is the primary determinant of your outcome later in life. That is the challenge that we potentially face from rising inequality. And just to reiterate the argument, from falling incomes, falling wages of low-educated adults, leading into falling marriage rates, leading into children facing high levels of inequality of household circumstances, and then that disadvantaging them for educational attainment and success in their own careers. So what can be done to reverse the curse, so to speak? If this really is a problem, do we have any tools at our disposal that are effective in changing this? And in particular, what could be done to make work pay better for less educated adults? Well, one thing that we have, actually the tools are quite non-extraordinary, you probably don't think about them very much, is the tax and transfer system itself. So this figure shows you the pre-tax inequality of income and post-tax inequality of income across the OECD. And you can see the light blue lines are market income. This is income before any taxes and transfers are applied. And the US is the one I've circled in red. It's near the far right, but actually the inequality of market income isn't that high in the US relative to many other countries. In fact, it's comparable to Luxembourg or to France even. The lower blue lines, the dark blue bars, those are the inequality of income after taxes and transfers have taken place. What distinguishes the US relative to many other countries is we have pretty high pre-tax income, but we don't do much to undo that through the tax and transfer system. We have a much less progressive tax and transfer system than many other countries. So the far right-hand line shows you the average pre-tax income and the average post-tax income, the blue bar, and that red arrow is the amount of reduction that the US does compared to the rest of the countries. The fact that that arrow doesn't reach all the way down says that we do less redistribution, less to mitigate market inequality than most other countries to which we compare ourselves. So one thing we can do is we can change the tax and transfer system. One way we actually do that, and a very effective way, is through a tool called the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a subsidy to work. It's a payment that supplements your income if you are a low-wage worker. So the more you work, the more benefit you get from this program. So in the United States, in 2015, if you were a married woman with 3 children or an unmarried woman with 3 children, and you were earning about $20,000 a year, you would get about $6,300 a year in wage subsidy. That's a very significant benefit. It increases household income, it allows parents to invest more in their children, and it makes work pay. It has the Earned Income Tax Credit, a program put in place by the Nixon administration, then supplemented by the Reagan administration, then expanded further by the Clinton administration, has been very effective at raising work among less educated women with children. Unfortunately, for men without dependent children, the maximum benefit is $503 relative to $6,200 for an adult with dependent children. Now, unfortunately, many of those men, in fact, do have children, as we were discussing earlier. They just don't get to claim them on their tax form because they are not married to the mother. This is an area where there's actually a lot of room for improvement. The U.S. could, if it wanted to, create an earner's credit that expanded the availability of this benefit to low-wage workers more broadly. It's different from the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a mandate on employers that they pay higher wages. That runs some downside risk of potentially reducing low-wage employment. This is a subsidy to people who have low earnings capacity, makes work pay better for them. And I will just mention that this has powerful anti-poverty effects. So according to analysis of tax data, 31.7 citizens in the U.S. in 2014 were either made less poor or lifted entirely out of poverty, in other words, lifted above the poverty line because of the earned income tax credit, 13.1 million of whom were children. Right? So this isn't just a subsidy to individuals, it is a subsidy, is a subsidy to families. Okay, given time, I'm going to cut short the other part of my talk, and let me just summarize the points I was making, and I'm happy to come back to this later on. So, inequality is something to worry about. Not to worry about it because it's bad per se, but because you could have too much or too little. I think the risk the U.S. runs is that we're at a point where inequality is sufficiently high that the dynamism that we get from it is potentially outweighed by the dynasticism that results. The inequality of circumstances at starting point among children has the risk of preventing them from realizing their potentials. The biggest leading indicator of this is falling male earnings and employment. It comes from several sources: stagnating education, the changing structure of occupations, and more recently, globalization itself. This matters because middle-class, two-parent families are in decline. Low-income kids suffer from underinvestment, and this potentially inhibits the operation of meritocracy and economic mobility, which I think are values that most citizens strongly agree are things that we want to preserve. Fortunately, we do actually have tools that can address this. In the long run, the most important tool is continued investment in education, continuing to, K through 12 and college, giving people the skills that are going to allow them to have successful careers in a skilled, demanding economy. But even in the short and medium term, we have other tools that have been shown to be effective at taking the edge off some of this inequality. Some of that is simple taxes and transfers. Some of these are targeted subsidies, like the Earned Income Tax Credit. They are expensive. I would argue that they're a good investment. So let me stop there, and then I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. Can we have the house lights up, please? I will recognize questioners, and Dr. Otter will answer them.
Don't be shy. Everyone right?
So, from a purely economic perspective,
Could you please stand up and
That's
be
okay.
loud? Is that the whole room here?
from a purely economic perspective, what are your thoughts on the major party candidates' plans?
So from a purely economic perspective, what are my thoughts on the major party candidates' plans? So I will say one thing that's noteworthy is both major party candidates seem to be addressing the same issues as the issues of the perception that economic mobility is potentially in decline, that there's a group of workers who are doing quite badly in the globalized economy, and the sense that the kind of a middle class American dream is to some degree under threat. They have completely opposing policies for how they're going to deal with that. Candidate Trump says, reducing immigration, taxing foreign imports, cutting taxes will restore that greatness. Candidate Clinton says, embracing open borders, dealing with a globalized economy, and raising taxes and making investments in citizens, including through educational subsidies, through paid family leave, will have the same effect. I think it's probably pretty obvious I'm more persuaded by the latter set of policies than the former set of policies. And I think you have to, looking at both of them, say, well, which of them add up? Even if whichever you believe, are they affordable? And I think that the math is more robust in the Clinton plan. It's expensive, but it's honest about being expensive. So I think that's as much as I'll say on that question.
Yes. Well, going back to your study, I have a question. Did you check how immigration affects the low-income number of population, increasing the number of population in low income, because you have more population, because the immigrants will fill that gap? Wouldn't that be a way of decreasing the wage because you have more population for the same number of jobs?
Sure. Okay. I think so. Yeah. So the question was, what role does immigration play in falling wages? And there's sort of two components to that. One is that many Mexican immigrants, so a large immigrant immigrant group in the United States, have low levels of education. So part of this is we have more low-educated workers than we would otherwise have if it weren't not for immigration, and that's true. Although it's absolutely the case that wages and employment have fallen for Caucasian American low-educated citizens. The second question is, how much of that is because we've imported so much low-educated labor, and wouldn't they be earning higher wages were it not for the high levels of immigration we have of low-educated workers? Is that a correct statement? So there I'm going to say the economic theory would say bringing in a lot of low-educated labor would reduce the wages of less educated citizens. The economic data, surprisingly, provides scant evidence of that. To the degree that there's been a robust study of the economics of immigration in the United States for decades, and it's hard to find really compelling evidence that immigrant workers have substantially reduced native wages. So, my intuition, I think, is where your intuition is, which suggests, we brought in a lot of low-skilled workers. Probably that's made things harder on native low-skilled workers. The data do not speak loudly on that point, surprisingly.
Yes.
Thank you. In the introduction, Dan talked about your doing research on worker adjustment to trade. It seems to me, I've read that the U.S. has not done a very good job of enabling workers who've lost their job because of globalization to shift. Would that be a substantial way of reversing the curse?
So the question is, good question, workers have not adapted well to trade. If we had better trade adjustment policies, would that help? So I think the answer is yes, that would help. And it's also the case that the U.S. has invests much less in what are called active labor market programs than many other advanced countries. The active labor market programs are programs that basically take workers who are displaced and try to give them both training and incentives to get back into the labor force. Our trade adjustment assistance program in particular is really just an extension of unemployment insurance benefits, and it's only available to you if you go to school. But perhaps going to school is not the right thing to do. Maybe it's to look for another job. Maybe it's even to take a new job at lower wages initially and hope to find something better. But you won't be doing that if you're in school. And so one idea that people talk about frequently, and that actually the Obama administration has proposed, is what's called wage insurance. So imagine I'm a $20 an hour worker in manufacturing. I lose my job, and guess what? There really isn't any manufacturing around that pays, that can use my skill set. So I'm going to have to take a job doing something else that's clearly not going to pay as well. Maybe I'm driving a truck. Maybe I'm working in a restaurant. So maybe I'm only going to make $12 an hour initially. Many people are not going to want to take that job. It's not only a loss of income, but it's an insult to their dignity. What wage insurance does is say, well, we're going to meet you halfway. For the first year, we'll pay 75% of the difference. For the next year, we'll pay 50%. Then we're kind of done. But at least that'll enable you to cushion the adjustment process and perhaps allow you to take initially a low-wage job and search for better employment while you're still working. So I don't think there's any way that this can be a huge lever for reversing this trend, but I think it would be a step in the right direction. And because for so long we've sort of told ourselves, and actually many economists have told us, that trade doesn't hurt anybody, we've had very stingy policies directed at helping people adjust to it. We now recognize, I think the evidence is very clear, that very sharp, sustained shocks like what occurred with China in the 2000s, look, it's good for China, it's good for much of the world, right? So I want to be clear, China's rise has brought 400 million Chinese out of poverty, it's raised prosperity throughout Central and South America, parts of Africa. From a world welfare point of view, it's one of the best things that's happened in centuries. It's also been hard on some low-income American adults. It would be good, since we actually gain from trade in net, to redistribute some of those benefits to workers who bear the brunt of that.
Yes.
At some point, the downward pressure, is it ever going to boil up? Are there constraints that you can only push down so long before there's a push back up? And what are the implications for that?
Yeah. So I think you spoke sufficiently. I think people probably heard what you said, which is good. There are periods when we actually see wages grow in the lower end of the labor market, and that occurs when labor markets are really tight. So during the mid-1990s, between 1995 and 1999, the unemployment rate in the U.S. was under 4 percentage points, and we actually saw rising wages and rising employment rates of non-college and high school grad and high school dropout adults. Even in the present, actually, we are starting to see a little bit of that. The unemployment rate is way down, wages are rising, and there's some pulling up at the bottom. It's hard for that to be a very, very powerful force, and the reason is that many of the lowest skilled jobs, those food service, cleaning, home health aid, security, they use skill sets that are generic, that most people possess and can be productive in those activities within a few days or a week or a couple weeks of training. So the skills aren't very scarce. And so there's an abundant supply of people who can do that work. What makes wages rise in that form of work is when those people are being brought into other opportunities. That happens when labor markets are really tight or when more people go for higher levels of education. So it's really the fact that we have a lot of people who don't have better options that keeps wages low because there's kind of no barriers to entry, right? So if all of a sudden we have a surge in demand for neurologists, well, it takes 10 years to produce new neurologists, so wages are going to rise. We won't have people flooding into that occupation. That's not what happens at the bottom of the labor market.
Others? Yes.
Yeah, so with your barbell job market, that goes along with typical economic theory. But one of the things that you said was that it's going to be a lot harder for the jobs on the right side of the barbell, the high-skilled jobs, such as doctors or lawyers, to be taken over by technology. And yet we're seeing supercomputers do things like find cancer with better accuracy and better efficiency than human doctors. And since supercomputers are now doing that, that usually means like a 10-year, maybe 15-year kind of outlook. Do you think that we're going to have to change our understanding of how technology can come over the labor market, or do you think it's going to continue along with current economic models?
Sure. It's a very sound question. It's a question that a lot of people are asking. We see all this technological change around us. How quickly, will this upend our assumptions about what skills are scarce and what skills are abundant, or what can be done by people, what can be done by machines? I think the most important thing to keep in mind in this discussion is that machines don't just substitute people; they complement people. Right? We've had 200 years of incredibly rapid technological progress. And in that time, wages have risen and employment has risen, in fact, right? So, tractors were invented to replace human toil with with mechanical power. Assembly lines, substituted inconsistent human handiwork with machine precision. Computers, replace slow, inaccurate human calculation with, digital perfection. Yet in that time, the fraction of adults employed at jobs has risen over the last 125 years and risen almost every decade. A lot of that is women moving out of unpaid, extremely demanding labor in the home into more interesting work in the marketplace. That's true because even as machines take over a subset of our tasks, they make the remaining ones more valuable, right? In other words, most things that we do require a range of skills, a range of activities, and as you automate some of them, the ones that remain are that much more valuable because they all need to be done together. So, if you only think about it in terms of machines substituting for labor, you might have thought at multiple points in the last 200 years that we would be running out of work. And so far that has not occurred. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen, right? Primarily, it is my observation, this is harder to prove, that most of the automation at the higher end of the labor market has complemented rather than substituted for skilled workers. It's made expertise more valuable. It's made judgment and creativity. There's strong complementarities between having a machine that can say, have you considered all these diagnoses? And a doctor who says, I know this patient, I know his history, I am perceiving these things that are not visible because you don't have the same vision, the same sensitivity, and in combination, we're a more effective doctor, right? I think automation poses a greater challenge actually in many of those low skill jobs because it's very clear that machine dexterity, vision, adaptability will rise. And so, in the long run, we will have fewer people working at restaurants, we'll have fewer people driving vehicles, we'll have fewer people, acting as security guards. So I think it does create a challenge. We have faced similarly disruptive technological challenges in the past 200 years. In the late 1800s, when automation was and fertilization, irrigation was improving rapidly in agriculture, we had a dramatic reduction in the number of farm jobs. So 68% of employment in the United States in 1840 was agricultural employment. In 1900, that was 40%. By 1940, that was 12%, I believe. Now, how did we adapt to that change? It wasn't automatic. It wasn't easy. It wasn't even costless. What the farm states did was they said, oh, well, we have a generation of youth that's not going to be needed on the farm, is not prepared for industry. What are we going to do? They mandated that all of their kids stay in school until at least the age of 16. That was radically expensive, not only because you had to pay teachers and build buildings, but because those kids couldn't be working in that time, which was costly for their families. It was probably also the best investment the U.S. made in the 20th century because it gave us the most flexible, the most skilled, and the most productive workforce of any country in the world. So that kind of adaptation was made successfully because of social investment. The market didn't just take care of it. It created a challenge. It also created an opportunity. And we responded wisely to that opportunity. I think we face similar challenges and similar opportunities at present.
Yes.
You mentioned minimum wage as a potential tool for addressing this inequality with a downside of easing employment. Can you give your perspective on arguments for or against significant minimum wage increase?
Sure. So, so the arguments for and against the minimum wage increase, and obviously the argument for the minimum wage increase is it does, the lowest paid workers in the economy get a raise if they maintain their employment. The argument against is employers have an incentive not to keep them employed if you raise their wages enough. Again, this has received, like the question of immigration, extensive study over multiple decades. In the U.S., over the last 30 years, it's hard to find evidence that increases in the minimum wage have had much of an effect on employment. But that is probably the reason for that is the minimum wage is so low in the United States and has fallen dramatically since the late 1970s. We're now at a point where the minimum wage is being raised very substantially in certain locations. In Seattle, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, as much as $15 an hour. We may very well start to see some of the downside costs of the minimum wage as well in terms of reduced employment. It could still boost earnings, could still boost total payments made to low-educated workers, but at the cost of making more of them involuntarily unemployed. It's not my favorite tool for addressing low wages. It's basically imposing a tax or a mandate on employers to solve a public problem. It's sort of like, rent control. It's a great way to get cheap housing for people unless you happen to be the owner of the house that was just effectively, made less valuable to you. So I don't think I think we have better tools. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a better tool. You can make an argument they should be used in conjunction because you don't want all the benefits of the EITC to accrue to employers if they start to lower wages because people are being subsidized. I think it's something that we need to use in moderation. And especially if we raise it enough that it appears that it's being, that minimum wage workers are working in globally traded services like manufacturing, well then that just makes it more difficult for us to produce those things domestically. So, sorry, that was a long answer. It's a good question. There's a lot of trade-offs. In general, it's in every sense of the word a second best tool. It's by no means an optimal economic policy, though sometimes the best policy is a feasible policy. That one's easier to pass because it doesn't appear to cost taxpayers money.
Yes.
Ben Bernanke recently published something at Brookings regarding a called a welfare index that instead of just using, say, GDP per capita, he included some other factors, one of which was income inequality as a way of measuring and comparing both in terms of between two countries and between a single country at two different points in time. We hear talk of income inequality, but there doesn't seem to be a easy measurement that's easy. I looked at a lot of your graphs and I had to think about them hard. I mean, there's not an easy way of doing that. Is Bernanke's idea, this welfare index, something that's worth pursuing? Are there other ways in which we can make this inequality visible and regularly measured?
Sure. So I think so the question is, are we, inequality is such a kind of a amorphous term. Isn't there a more concrete and comparable across time, across places, across people measure of this that we should think of a kind of a welfare index? So I agree with you that the term inequality is kind of overloaded. And I tried to make the argument that my concern is about opportunity for less affluent adults and less affluent and their children much more than the wages at the top of the distribution. I think I don't think a single index can really do it. I think, I'm much more enamored of saying, let's look at the, bottom quartile of households and say, do they have sufficient resources? Do they have access to adequate education, nutrition, safety, and other things? Even our poverty measure that we use in the U.S. is woefully out of date. And it's also usually based on pre-market incomes when there's lots of transfers. So if you want to measure actual poverty in the United States much more effectively than the poverty line, look at the consumption of low-income households. That's a measure of actually what they are actually buying as opposed to what the dollars nominally enter their hands. And there it doesn't actually look as bad as the pure income numbers. So I think better measurement is important, but we need to know what we're after when we're doing that. And I think most of the time it's helpful to focus on a specific group or a specific problem and then say, what's the right way to quantify that? So I think I agree with Bernanke that in general the terms are too loose and we could do a better job, but I don't think a single number will probably be the optimal answer.
Yes. Donald Trump has argued that NAFTA and CAFTA and a number of other treaties need to be renegotiated, and that we need to bring some of these manufacturing jobs back from Mexico and China and Vietnam and wherever. How realistic is it that we would be able to renegotiate existing treaties? And secondly, how realistic it is to bring those jobs back, and where would they go?
Yeah. So on the question of treaties, this is something that has been obviously has received a lot of attention, but not a lot of insight in the election season. Although it's regularly asserted that NAFTA and CAFTA was, the worst treaty that America has ever signed, there's very little evidence that suggests that. So I'm not doctrinaire on this point at all. I think China's accession to the WTO actually had a huge economic effect on the U.S., far more than anyone anticipated. NAFTA really wasn't that big a deal. Part of the reason was Mexico didn't have a lot of productivity growth in this period. We were already pretty tightly integrated with it. It just wasn't that disruptive. But so I'd say NAFTA, but more broadly looking forward, can we bring those jobs back to the U.S.? I think by and large the answer is not to any substantial degree. The U.S. is a relatively high-wage economy. We're just not going to be making a lot of labor-intensive textiles and leather goods and doing a lot of labor-intensive assembly here. It's not that, the jobs that were lost, for example, to Chinese competition over the last 15 years were mostly the least well-paid, most labor-intensive production jobs in the United States. We may see some reshoring of manufacturing as technology advances. A lot of that will be extremely capital intensive. It'll be machine intensive. So people say all the time, once we have these sewing robots and leather robots, all this work will come back from Bangladesh, from Pakistan. Well, I think there's two problems with that argument. One, it will come back but be mostly done by machines. It won't, by and large, be production workers. And two, unfortunately, I do think it could be really quite disruptive for the developing world when a lot of the labor-intensive services that they provide to the rich world, embodied in goods, is now done, by robots. So although, in general, in response to the earlier question, I actually am not particularly concerned about the consequences of automation for the developed world, where much of the work that we do is cognitively intensive, not repetitive. I am actually quite concerned about it for the developing world, where we may be poised to automate a lot of the things that they do that are valuable for us at present. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but let me make one final point on that. Although I don't think of manufacturing as a jobs program, manufacturing is extremely important to the U.S. economy. Not only is it a substantial share of our value added, it's also the case that a huge amount of innovation in the U.S. economy occurs in manufacturing. About 2/3 of all patents and about 70% of all R&D. So we should care about manufacturing because it's where a lot of our ideas come from, and therefore a lot of our wealth, but not per se to just create mass employment. I wish it would do that, but I don't think that's at all likely in this century.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed listening to it. I was wondering, you mentioned in your talk America is very good at making high school students pursue an undergraduate, but less good at making them follow through on that.
Yeah.
I come from Sweden, and in Sweden it's not necessarily looked as a bad sign to not go on to an undergraduate straight after high school, but instead get a job to maybe learn more about what you want to pursue studying. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, or if you think it is purely beneficial to send a high school student straight to college, or if you think it's better to maybe offer more internship programs, or maybe change the structure of high school to make a 17 or 18-year-old person realize what they want to pursue.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think that, I'm glad you asked it, because I think this, if I inadvertently sort of fed into the kind of college for all mantra, that was not my intention, because it's not the case that, first of all, there are many good jobs that don't actually require a college education. They require post-secondary education. They require post-high school education. So there are skilled jobs in the trades. There are skilled jobs in medical paraprofessions. There are skilled jobs in repair. There's a growing category of skilled work that doesn't require a traditional four-year college degree. The U.S. underinvests in vocational and technical and apprenticeship training relative to many other countries, Sweden being one example. So I think we need to I think we have a legacy view that for many people high school was fine, and then for a subset you go to college. And if you didn't go to college, then we were done. You would just go into the trades, you would go work in a factory, et cetera. That's less and less viable. People need some additional skill set, but it doesn't have to be just purely a liberal arts degree. That's too one-sided a solution.
Yes.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I know, as you showed in your data, that education is key to long-term wealth. And I know that maybe in the ideal world, a lot of people would then pursue college education, which would then increase their labor supply for the market. And then in order to get ahead, just because you have more people involved, would that then incentivize people to pursue more post-college degrees? I guess an example for myself is that I'm a political science major, and what I think it was like a classic case of like law school. I see a lot of law students going to law school and then struggle to find jobs right out of the gate just because there's that intense competition. At what point does this kind of become an education arms race to see who has the highest degree, and then does that, in a sense, benefit those who have parents who've had those high degrees, who have that wealth background, and just kind of upsets that meritocracy that we try to pursue?
Right, it's a good question. If it's all musical chairs, right, then you just have to get more education because other people are getting more education. It's not actually productive, right? That's the concern. the evidence that the evidence we have on the value of K through 12 education and its kind of productive value is pretty unassailable. It's clear that when you force people to go for another year of when the U.S. raised school leaving laws to keep people in school to age 16, or when the U.K. or when Ireland did the same thing, we see these big jumps in earnings of those cohorts. Those kids obviously were more productive. It's harder to do the same experiments with college. We don't have mandatory college. We don't have the same level of experimentation. I've actually been working for the last 5 years on a very large experiment in the state of Nebraska that's randomizing college scholarships. And we will learn about over time what effect this has not only on people's educational attainment and completion, but on their earnings as adults, their financial stability, their indebtedness, and so on. So I think that it's hard to say with certainty that or it would be inaccurate to say, actually, that all of the higher earnings of college graduates is purely because they went to college. Many of the most capable people, even if they hadn't gone to college, would have been successful. But I don't think it's purely musical chairs. I think there's a reason why employers are willing to pay more and more over time for highly educated workers, and it's because they have more things for them to do. Right? If you imagine taking the labor force of 1900 and plunking them in the present, many of them would be unemployable because they would lack the basic literacy and numeracy skills to do contemporary jobs. Despite their kind of strong backs and good characters, they just wouldn't know enough. And so we've had to invest in ourselves and improve our skill set because the set of things that we're called upon to do has fundamentally been changed by our technologies. And so I do think that will remain important.
Yes.
Policy that isn't often talked about is
Louder, please.
Sorry, a policy that isn't often talked about is basic income or universal basic income. I know the Swiss voted on it in June and actually defeated it, but I was wondering what you think about it. I know people who support it say that it'll help streamline like a welfare system, and that it can help people who want to pursue higher education, and it can help people who can find a job. And I know people who oppose it say that it hurts productivity, that causes inflation. Sure. And
yeah. So the question is a universal basic income, right? Some people call it UBI, some call it a MINCOME. I think that the first thing to recognize is there's really a continuum of this, and to some degree, we already have that in the sense that everyone in the U.S. who's a citizen has access to public education. Everyone in the U.S., if you show up at an emergency room, they will care for you if you are in imminent danger. We have food banks. We have a variety of things that guarantee some level of resources to individuals, regardless of their initial circumstances. But we don't do that in the form of cash, right? It's almost all done in kind. You can get food stamps, or what's called SNAP. You can get medical care, you get education, you get shelter, but you can't just get cash. So the question is, should we extend that to just giving people cash? I think there's some positive arguments for that. The biggest being, look, kids don't get to choose how much their parents work. And kids would benefit a lot if there were, adequate resources in the household. I think the downside of that is that it does disincentivize work. It does, it makes it increasingly feasible for people to have an adequate standard of living without having to necessarily do much at all. And I think that there's some risk of further depressing labor force participation. And I think that's a real cost, both because when people work, they pay taxes on that income, but also because I think it structures people's lives and their time and their identity. So I'm more positive about subsidies to employment, like the earned income tax credit, than I am to pure cash transfers towards households. But I think one can come down in different places on that, and I think we should recognize that we do make a lot of universal transfers, not in the form of cash, but in the form of other necessities that are almost guaranteed to citizens. I want to say almost because obviously there are holes in that safety net.
Others? Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for your questions.